Hello everyone. Welcome to another Parking Reform Network event, Autonomous Vehicles and Parking Reform. Today, we're going to explore what an AV future means for parking reform, how to separate reality from the hype, and what policies our cities should implement right now. We are thrilled to be joined by our expert panelists, Dr. Andrew Miller, Dr. Miriam Pinski, and Dr. Rachel Weinberger. Thank you all for being here. Our moderator is going to be President of PRN, Tony Jordan, and I am Paula Acero, organizer and event coordinator at Parking Reform Network, and I'm so happy to see all you with us today. So let's begin. First, Dr. Miriam Pinski researches transportation policy at the Shared Use Mobility Center and advocates for safer streets as a steering committee member of Streets for All. She holds a doctorate and master's in urban planning from UCLA and is working on a book about driver's license policy. Thank you for being with us, Miriam. Now, Dr. Rachel Weinberger is an internationally recognized transportation policy expert and the chair for transportation at the Regional Plan Association, where she leads research on transportation and mobility for the New York metropolitan area. Her research and public testimony have helped shape debates on congestion pricing, rail investment, parking and curb management, and the economic value of transportation infrastructure. Thanks for being here with us, Rachel. And Andrew Miller. Dr. Andrew Miller is an expert on innovative mobility. He is the co-author of The End of Driving, the leading academic work on the rise of autonomous vehicles. He writes frequent deep dives on new mobility, innovation, and transit at his weekly newsletter, Changing Lanes. And now I want to introduce today's moderator, PRM President and Founder, Tony Jordan. He established the Parking Reform Network in 2019 to educate the public on how parking policy intersects with critical issues like housing, climate change, and the environment. And with this all said, Tony, the floor is yours. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Hello. Hello. Thank you, everybody. And thanks for everyone. Thank you, Paula, for introducing us. Thanks, panelists, for being here. This is a topic I'm very interested in. I'm super excited to have all these great panelists here. I was calling it a super panel the last couple days of really, as the description said, we're not looking at hype. We're not looking at doom and gloom. We're trying to find kind of the missing middle of the AV discussion here and really cut into what's going on our streets. And the idea here at the end is also I want everyone to leave with some ideas around what we can do in our communities and what policies we can promote and what actions we can take to lead towards better outcomes and scenarios as far as the introduction of this technology and these mobility options. So first, we're going to we've had some bios, but I want to let people have a chance to do a quick intro here. And then Andrew will kick us off with a kind of just overview of where we are right now in the autonomous vehicle world. So we'll start with Rachel, if you want to take a minute or two and share any additional information, and then we'll go to Miriam. Yeah.
I extemporaneous speaking is my favorite thing. Here I go. No, I think Paula's introduction was sufficient for the conversation. I've obviously participated in a few conversations on autonomous vehicles, and I think the only thing I add is my favorite thing to do is solve problems, or at least suggest solutions to problems, and we'll see what happens after that.
Miriam, how about yourself?
Sure. So I wanted to quickly highlight a report that my co-authors and I came out with through Urbanism Next. And it's on kind of looking at the landscape of regulations for different new shared mobility types, including, of course, AVs, and kind of seeing how those regulatory regimes differ by mode. And it's also just been interesting to watch AVs kind of mature in the context of some other work I've done on the history of particularly driver's license policy, but early auto regulations, and the ways that policy trajectory maps or doesn't map. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And so Andrew, you're next. And as I mentioned, please kick us off with kind of an overview of what's real, what's hype, what is the timeline, where are we at really with autonomous vehicles, robotaxis, cars?
Sure thing. The only thing I'd add to Paula's introduction is that while I talk a lot about automated driving, my real interest is innovative mobility, how we move people and goods today and how we might do it in the coming decades. And I write about it every week at my newsletter, Changing Lanes, which I will put that here in the chat so anyone who wants to can flip over there and check it out. But to answer your question, I'll do that. I'm not going to try and type and talk this in. I'll put it out in a few minutes. But to answer your question, the first thing to understand about automated vehicles is that if you think that they're fake or a con, I wouldn't blame you for that, because people talked so much nonsense about this technology from roughly 2005 to roughly 2020, and it poisoned the well. So many people I talk to now think that it's still a dodge or a cheat somehow. And they're not wrong. They were just ahead of their time. It's not a dodge. It's real. You can get Waymo today. 40% of the ride-hail trips being taken in San Francisco are being accommodated by Waymo now. It's across California. It's across the US Sunbelt. It's coming to a variety of cities, maybe not Washington, D.C., but we'll talk about that, I think. But it's just announced that Waymo is coming they're already in Japan. They're going to London, but it was just announced a few weeks ago that they're coming to Germany and the Netherlands and Iberia, so Spain and Portugal. So it's real. It's coming to a global city near you. I haven't even said anything about China. So the question is not, is this technology real? It is. The question is, can we keep it out of our cities? Maybe in the near term. I would submit not in the long term. So what we should be thinking about is not how do we get rid of this? It is, if it's coming, how do we get the best deal for our cities now? And I say now because the best time to you've got the most leverage now as an urban leader. You should be making, when they really want to come in, now is a good time to be going to Waymo or Tesla or Zoox or whoever and saying, we'll let you in under these conditions. Every year that passes, the leverage decreases. So the smart play is to think about how can automated driving make our cities better and proceed on that basis immediately.
Mute myself. Thank you. Thank you. So I think there's two futures. I think we had a pre-planning call here and we talked about this, and there's kind of two main paths we can take as a society on autonomous vehicles. We have a private ownership model and a shared mobility model. And I'm going to go back to Andrew one more time here to just get your thought on which is more likely, and then what are the factors that might lead to one over the other right now? And then I'd like to ask Rachel and Miriam to talk about what each future might mean for our cities respectively.
Okay, I'll answer briefly because I've already had my bite at this apple. I'll say that driving automation is going to come for the privately owned car, but it's also going to come for ride hail. So you can have a self-driving personal vehicle, but you can also have a self-driving cab. There's no world in which self-driving doesn't lead to much more congestion. That's just going to happen. I don't see any way around that. So the question is, what is the good thing that you can get? And my argument is that everything you don't like about the personal car, the privately owned AV is that on steroids. It's going to make everything worse and nothing better. Well, it makes some things better. It'll be safer. People will have more time. I don't want to be a zealot here, but it's for the externalities of the privately owned self-driving car are immense. You can't imagine the size of those externalities. The externalities of the robotaxi are much less. If everyone knows that they can get a cheap ride-hail ride, like 40% cheaper, that's always going to be there in 3 minutes and that it is safe and that will never be involved in an incident. If we have the right policy, that'll encourage people to own fewer cars and rely more on a robotaxi fleet. coupled with other good policy improvements, we can make our cities better. So, but we only get that if we make the policy improvements to let the robotaxis in on our terms. If we do nothing, we can kill robotaxis because they won't be commercially viable. But privately owned personal AVs are everywhere. And brother, you ain't seen nothing yet. That's a future to avoid. We should be proactive to avoid it. And I'll throw it to Miriam and Rachel.
Yeah. Rachel, want to chime in?
Miriam, you unmuted first, so why don't you go ahead? Okay, so I mean, I have to agree with Andrew. I'm going to just frame it a little bit more bluntly in a way. I think, Tony, you sort of posit two possible futures, but I think we're going to get both. Right. So, and I think it's interesting the trajectory of the conversation has been originally it was basically the sense was autonomous vehicles are coming and every individual is going to own one. And then there started to be this conversation about, no, they'll be all shared vehicles, which made the whole thing a little bit more palatable. Right. So that actually gives a patina of acceptance. But the reality is, I think most people use their automobile as an extension of their closet to some extent. There's also a huge amount of convenience that your car's right there, even if you just call it up. But to this point about everything that the private vehicle is on steroids, there was a research project a few years back. Joan Walker at UC Berkeley tried to emulate AVs prior to their actual existence, and she got some money that allowed her to supply people with a car and a driver. And so they had a car and a driver, so the driver could drive them as if the vehicle itself was driving, and people vastly increased their VMT. So the thing that I'm going to say now, and I probably will repeat it several times during this conversation, is what cities need to do. I mean, there's a question of, can you keep them out of your cities? Do you want to keep them out of your cities? What cities need to do is actually the same thing that I think that they've been needing to do for many years, just around conventional automobiles, whether they're electric or combustion engine. And that is minimize your need for them, right? The more that your city is walkable, micromobilityable, transitable, and the less you are reliant on individual vehicles, which are extraordinarily inefficient from all kinds of directions, in terms of the amount of space they take up, in terms of the amount of pollution that they contribute, things like that. So I think as cities continue, and I'm very heartened to see New York City is really pushing some of their livable streets agenda very quickly. And so as Paris has done over the past 15, 20 years even. So the less we really need to have cars at all, then the question is, how do autonomous vehicles serve the occasional need for a private automobile, which does exist and will exist, right? And then also understanding that the urban context and the urban needs is distinct from the lower density suburban and rural contexts, which are really quite different. So I'll have lots more chances to say that same thing again. So for the moment, I will yield to Miriam.
Sure. I mean, briefly, I think, a free chauffeured trip will, of course, be much more enticing than a, trip that is paid for, right? And so I think, a big part of this is thinking about how do we price AVs, but not just that. When we think about these externalities with congestion pricing, et cetera, how do we, the same externalities that AVs impose are similar to the ones that, just general human driver cars pose, right? And so I think it would make sense that if we're going to try and tax some of these, things to limit some of the externalities, we don't just do that with AVs, which from my perspective, the safety benefits are huge. Even if you have a street lined with AVs waiting in traffic, I think as a cyclist perspective, I would much prefer that to one with speeding, reckless drivers. So anyway, I think it is, we'll get back to this, but it's thinking about the policy outcomes we care about and how do we balance that. And yes, it very much depends on the type of location. Are we talking about Manhattan? Are we talking about, a more rural or just suburban area. And how do transit agencies adapt to that too?
If I may jump in, Tony, before your next question, the one thing that I am hopeful everybody can do starting today is put a check on auto highway infrastructure expansion by using the leverage of what's expected with autonomous vehicles. They need less space to drive in, right? So you could make narrower lanes, or if we don't envision them as the same boxes that we drive now, but you could even have like a half vehicle for one person to ride in or something like that. I mean, there's lots of, if we're thinking about changing the technology. So anytime somebody wants to widen a rural highway in your area or a suburban one, the answer really is, well, in 20 years, when everything's autonomous, we're not going to need a wider road. We could restripe this one and get additional capacity that way. It's a little bit dishonest or disingenuous because, all the while in the background, I'm like reduce, reliance on these individual vehicles. But in the meanwhile, that just seems like a really fantastic opportunity there.
Yeah, thanks. And we'll talk.
People are already using that argument to make sure that we don't invest in public transit. So I agree with Rachel that it's disingenuous, but I also agree with Rachel that if the other side's going to use it that way, then we should use it that way. It's the argument available to all.
Leveraging the narrative is something that I think from the land use and parking perspective, we've also, really, I think is underappreciated. It's out there, wield it for getting people to believe. And we'll talk more about that a little later. There was a mention of a study, and I do want to talk about models, the map and the territory, right? Like, there's a lot of posts we see, a lot of press that every time there's a study that comes out that shows some projected VMT increase or some VMT model, vehicle mile travel modeling or additional driving congestion, whatever the negative externality is based on, ride share modeling or observed data. But I want to ask particularly Miriam and Rachel, like, what do these studies, the VMT, the cruising congestion studies actually say? And what are their assumptions? And one thing that I wonder about personally is they're often taken kind of in isolation, right? They're not looking at the land use changes we're making, removing parking mandates. We haven't really talked a lot about this yet, but if we leverage the potential for autonomous vehicles to reduce the space we are giving to cars on the curb and in our cities and make them more walkable, we know that there are studies that maybe say that reduces VMT as well. So how do we look at balancing, like, we might get additional trips from people having more convenient options, but there are other land use levers other levers we can do to balance that out. And can we actually reduce the trips overall? What does the data say? And what should we be believing, hype versus, doom and gloom?
I'm letting you go first this time,
Miriam.
Well, I'm not a modeling expert. I will say that a lot of this depends obviously on your assumptions, and especially when we're using kind of like creating scenarios it really depends. The different policies you could implement, each of them build off each other too. Like if you were just to unbundle parking, but you can't really only isolate the effect of unbundling parking if you're also pricing the driving, if you're also, so there's various things where like it would depend on the mix of policies, and that also then impacts like the cost and the desire of people to drive, take a Waymo more, or for the Waymo company to allow it to cruise more, or whatever the algorithm ends up being. I think in general, my like hot take on this is that I, as a transportation enthusiast and someone who cares about people being able to live full lives, my tendency is to want to encourage people to take trips. There seems to be a strain in kind of a lot of these discussions around how do we limit VMT. And some of that I think discounts, like there are a lot of people who could probably use more VMT. And how do we try to encourage the most efficient use of the roads on the one hand, while also encouraging trips? So I don't want to be purely negative on, wow, this will actually enable more trips. In some ways, that's kind of nice. So yeah.
Okay, so I'll jump in on that. And Miriam raises an interesting point that I can only disagree with vehemently. I think we need to really unpack the mobility question from the accessibility question. And I think that, and I don't know, Miriam, maybe you could clarify, but I'm guessing that some people could and should take more trips is probably a shorthand for some people could and should have more access to more opportunities, and more activities. And I think that that's right. But back to your original question, Tony, I think there's no analysis that shows autonomous vehicles lead to reductions in VMT if they are one-for-one replacements for people's cars. There is some narrative that if they are all in the service of as TNCs, that maybe there could be, but there's also anti-evidence to that, right? Based on what the TNCs have done, right? Uber and Lyft have added congestion to dense urban centers, and so that's more VMT. The last time I looked at the numbers, yellow cabs in New York and TNCs tend to be empty 40% of their driving time. So unless we had much greater efficiency and usage, that's just a lot of waste. So we have to really think carefully about how to restrict that. And, the simple answer, the KISS answer, keep it simple, stupid, is reduce our reliance on private automobility. And there's lots of evidence in lots of places where that has been quite effective. So I think that is really the path that we need to be on, regardless of what the technology is that is turning the wheels.
I want to just ask, Miriam kind of touched on this a little bit about just the reality of the existing cars. And I think one of the frustrations I have is just when we talk about deadheading or driving with no passengers or whatever, there's a whole slew of this driving that occurs on a day-to-day basis from private operators, does not discount the danger from autonomous vehicles or the impact, but where are there studies that actually look in, like, how do we balance this out and show people, like I've said, my city of Portland, look, we have people very upset about some hypothetical amount of traffic that might occur in the future when right now 100% of the traffic in Portland is being driven by a human being. And we're worried about a 6% increase in traffic potentially from a autonomous vehicle. How do we unpack that or show that to people so that we understand where the real problem currently is?
Yeah, I mean, has anyone seen a school drop-off or pickup line? Like, these are things that can be, in part, I think, helped and liberate parents, right, from that extra driving on the way back, rather than a parent dropping off the kid and then having to wait in a line and get all the way home. That car can then, pick up another child, or, ideally there would be efficient ways to do this, but there's still a benefit there of a more socially beneficial trip that can be made, um, rather than basically the parent driving back, as an example. So I don't know of a study that has kind of measured that,
Right.
but I can't imagine that it's all just extra driving that gets created.
Right. So I remember a time when we used to walk to school. But I think that, take the kid to school and then deadhead home, it's very akin to an airport trip, right? How do you get to the airport, right? What's the more efficient way to do that? So I think that's a nice way to think about that. But as it is today, I take my kid to school by bike. So we're not adding to traffic in that same way, but I'm deadheading home. Right. So it's in that sense, it's similar, but yeah, there's ways that we have developed our lifestyles around automobility that, that we might want to rethink, like that your kid doesn't go to a neighborhood school. which is common. I'm not putting a
Quickly
judgment on
though,
it, but I'm just saying, right?
I'm sure a lot of parents would feel a lot safer having their kids bike to school if the other cars were Waymos.
Maybe.
Maybe. I mean, I
Maybe.
think right now, I mean, I think that that would be a pretty rational, personally, a pretty rational thought. But I mean, I think that we probably won't get into this much, but public opinion, on this is going backwards, right? People are becoming apparently less trustful of autonomous vehicles than they were 5, 10 years ago. People might be becoming less trustful of everything. So I don't know how we tease that out, but it's a, yeah, Rachel, you were going to say
Well,
something?
that's the same problem, that people think that they're safer driving than flying, right? Because they think that they somehow, if they're in control, right?
Mhm.
So I think there's an irrationality there that's not new.
It's
Right.
also the case that AV is getting caught up in the backsplash of AI. No one likes AI, and as AVs gets caught up in it, okay, I like AI, but like in so many things, I'm a technocrat and I'm not in the majority. Uh, and the more AI gets big, the more people are going to mistrust AV just on general principle. But to Miriam and Rachel have been speaking about the situation. I've been monitoring the chat. There's a desire for like solutions. I
Yeah.
got two. I got two for you. I'll just throw them out. I wonder what Rachel and Miriam think of them. There's a micro and a macro. The macro one is what we need is, say it with me, road pricing. Like it's the only tool we have to fight congestion. And AVs actually, okay, Rachel disagrees. We'll give her the floor afterwards. But I think actually New York is a shining city on the hill for the rest of North America, that you can do congestion pricing in North America. So Toronto should, and LA should, and Chicago should. Mere fitting local circumstances, but you should absolutely do it. The wrinkle is if we're going to have a lot more congestion because of AVs, now more than ever, we need to do it. But what you can do, to Rachel's sneaky point earlier about how you make it work, you come in and say, what we're going to do is we're going to scale this, and the number of people in the car, the cost goes down. The fewer the people in the car, the cost goes up. And if there's no people in the car, it's just a robot deadheading, as we say, it's much higher. I think that is a wedge you can use to get some constituencies on board that wouldn't otherwise be on board with road pricing. But it'll genuinely help if robotaxi companies know they're paying through the nose for empty kilometers, or pardon me, empty miles driven. That will help a lot. Then there's the macro one is we all want roads to be more efficiently used. That means having shared trips. One thing we know, courtesy of the pandemic, but also before, is that Americans loathe shared trips. Most people won't do it. Some will only do it if you get a real big discount. No one will do it if you don't make it worth their while. People like their privacy too much, or to your point, Tony, they're afraid of their fellow American too much. They just don't want to share that space. Pardon me. Automated vehicles, this is purely theoretical. I don't know of anyone that's actually saying they're going to do it, but I don't know any reason it could not be done. You can imagine a shuttle bus with 4 doors and 4 separate compartments, a shared vehicle where you cannot interact with another person. That's what I think a lot of Americans want. That's the only way that with my impoverished imagination, I can see shared rides ever becoming like a thing at scale in an American or a Canadian market. So I would say that because the companies are probably not going to do that on their own, that's another condition that you say. You say, okay, Waymo, you want to come in, you've got to devote a certain amount of your fleet to this part of town that's a transit desert. You got to have a certain proportion of your fleet that's equipped to handle wheelchairs so that that community can get improved mobility. You got to have a certain proportion of your fleet that is shared because we want to try and maximize. Like there's endless conditions that you can ask for. You just have to think carefully about what you want, prioritize them, and then for the love of God, you have to ask for them. Because if you do not ask, you will not get.
And real quick, I definitely want your both response, and I want to frame this also because this was one of the things is we've moved into policy lever questions, and so please, Miriam, do talk about the other policy levers, and I want to throw just a couple out there that are out there. I mean, something new, like it is just last week. I think New Jersey has said we have to have LiDAR, or they're proposing a bill saying LiDAR is required on all autonomous vehicles potentially. We have Washington D.C. looking to try to maybe be more restrictive. We have Texas, which is kind of like a place where they're letting them happen more. So yeah, please, Miriam, jump in and let's talk about policy solutions.
Oh, well, I was just going to jump on to what Andrew was saying and say, why have the government ask for certain features? Let the market provide. I'm sure these companies are thinking through what the most sellable version of a robo-taxi is already. And I think actually an impediment is the restrictions that we put onto innovative vehicles, which is, so that's one component. I think, one of the great things about AVs and what's so promising also in terms of land use is like, okay, yes, it's a learning curve. Like we're learning every day the things that AVs aren't great at. And we can, with, those experiences, program them never to do those things again. You can program a robotaxi never to speed again, for example. But similarly, that could also be, there's a lot of promise there for what we can do with curb space and preventing idling and, other dangerous situations for cyclists. And that, that's something that local governments can really think through. Like, how do they envision an otherwise really congested curb space with a machine that can be programmed to move how it wants it to move. So I think that in that sense, it's kind of an exciting component, and also AVs lend themselves really well to like we can then charge pretty seamlessly, I think. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Rachel.
I want to first just acknowledge that Stephanie Pollock is in the audience, and thank you for joining us. I'm certainly humbled to have your participation, but also I think you sort of called me out on something. So I just want to sort of note, and what she called me out on is this question of mobility versus accessibility. So I'm gonna just dwell on it a moment longer. I agree with Miriam and with Stephanie that in most of the United States, mobility is the answer to accessibility. But what I'm advocating for is that we continue to move in a direction of densification, so that is less and less the key to it all. In terms of congestion pricing, in terms of road pricing, in terms of pricing everything, in terms of the market providing, I think there's room for us to be much more creative about it. I think congestion pricing works well in contexts where there's a strong center. And I think that, I think we also always forget that Singapore has been doing congestion pricing for 50 years quite successfully. Sometimes we get these buzzwords. I don't know that we need to price everything. I think sometimes it depends on how we allocate the street space. I think there are certainly some places, like I'll talk about New York, my home city of my birth, city where I currently live and mostly where I work and where congestion pricing has just been passed. I think congestion is very democratic to some extent, in that most of the people who are in congestion choose it in New York. I don't think that's an argument against, I see Miriam cringing. I don't think that you should externalize your impediments onto other people. I think that there are things that should be privileged, like first responders, emergency vehicles. I think also delivery is very different, but a lot of people who are sitting in congestion had a very viable alternative. So I think there's a case where you do definitely want to price it all, but I think where you have all kinds of alternatives, or more alternatives can be created. I've been in many European cities that don't feel very congested. Munich did not have a lot of traffic. Toronto certainly does, and I'll be up there in a couple of weeks at a congestion pricing roundtable. I was just in London, which feels very congested in some ways, even though it's had congestion pricing for a huge long time, but is rife with alternatives. There are bike highways and lanes and buses every couple of seconds. I mean, I was very envious as a New Yorker of what they're doing in London. So I think some of it is, pricing time by providing alternatives. So I do think we have alternatives. I also think that we're missing an opportunity to be creative here too, in terms of really, again, how we think about what the vehicles are. I think that, Andrew, I love your divided shared vehicle idea, but what if the vehicle was just one little teeny tiny pod? So you could get a lot more of them in the same street space, right? So I just think that they could move sideways. So Tony, I don't know if you want to move the conversation into curb management and implications for parking and so on, but there's an opening to do that.
Well, real briefly, because you bring up because there has been some speculation about what could be, I wanted to just bring back right now to in the current moment, what we have going on is we have two companies primarily, or a couple companies. We have a couple companies that are providing shared robo-taxi type services, primarily Waymo, that is trying to roll out to cities across the United States. And there's local opposition in various ways, often trying to restrict, maybe have restrict numbers, restrict areas, restricting, like putting restrictions on it. And then we have a private model, primarily Tesla, that is slowly creeping forward with releasing features that edge on autonomy, wink, wink, nod, nod. No, the person, it's not really, but it kind of is. And I just feel like we're advocates in transportation and land use are kind of like we're stuck in this spot where it's not clear what we can do to influence that outcome, and to really look at what happens if we don't. I think there's a real concern that we're going to, at least my concern is that we're going to kind of stifle the rollout of a shared model. Meanwhile, at some point Elon Musk is going to flip a switch and we're just going to be on the road with a bunch of these vehicles anyway, and we've kind of lost. Someone asked in the chat, why does it harm cities to wait? And I think partly it's because it's really hard to put the genie's already coming out of the bottle, and it's really hard to put it back in. And so I do want to make sure we think about what are some of the, and some of the policies we might look at, or what are realistic things cities should and can be asking for right now that might shift this narrative versus kind of the discourse we're in. And I'll open it up to the three of you. Miriam's already unmuted.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, again, that really is a matter of governments figuring out a way to balance the outcomes they want. And I think right now it seems like cities sometimes are viewing AVs as this business they can tax, or a business that they want to limit so it doesn't compete with professional drivers. And with a new technology, like when cars first came, local governments and also different state governments might create totally different regulations. And that can be challenging and costly to kind of navigate through those differences. So it's also a matter of thinking through where's the appropriate authority, what are the costs, but also the benefits of different regulations, and who should basically be doing this work. I think when it comes to curb stuff, local government makes a lot of sense. If we're talking about safety and vehicle standards and things, clearly, to me, the federal government should be intervening there and data reporting. And with liability, which is a huge, you could have a whole webinar on liability in AVs. That seems to be pretty much in the state sphere. Yeah.
I would go back to the logically prior, which is, what problem are we trying to solve? Because the autonomous vehicle companies are trying to solve this problem. How do we make the most money? Okay. So I think from a public perspective, sorry, there's an autonomous or non-autonomous helicopter flying overhead. The question really is, what do cities want themselves to look like, right? So if it's efficient curb operations, then as Miriam says, there's lots of local agenda setting, and you can do that. And it's not that different from any kind of private use, single use vehicle, right? So I think then the question is, if you're trying to solve how to allow people to make more trips to access more of the things they need to access, and then this is a way to do that, then pricing doesn't solve that problem actually, right? So you can't sort of try to reduce the impact of vehicles at the same time as you're trying to advance an equity agenda by having that, right? So I think the question, it's really that basic. What problem are you trying to solve? If you're just trying to put a firewall up against autonomous vehicles, I think to Tony's original point, that's not going to happen. It's probably not a good idea. It's probably not a good idea to try. I think, you know, if so that's really then the policy has to flow from there.
Okay.
I would say,
go
I
ahead.
mean, if Tony, if your question is, what is it that cities want? Like, leave AVs aside for the moment. What do cities want? What they want is to be less congested, because driving, road congestion's antithetical to all the things that we like about cities. You want to be close, you want to be walkable, you want to be able to safe to get around on a bike. The more cars there are on the road, it's not impossible to do those things, but it's harder to do those things. So, but you can't do away with cars entirely. Rachel said up at the front that, many people, a car trip is the right sort of trip, and we don't want to deny it to them. So the question is, what do AVs allow you to do that conventional cars don't allow you to do? And what do robotaxis allow you to do that a privately owned AV doesn't allow you to do? I think the answer is that you can't really solve congestion. In cities, they're moving slow, so everyone's moving close together anyway. You're not going to get much. There's not much juice to be squeezed there. The one thing you can do, and I note that we are at a gathering of the Parking Reform Network, is you can change where vehicles are stored. It doesn't need to be the case in a world where driving automation is, the majority, or even just the plurality of vehicles on the road, that every location needs to have a spot to store vehicles nearby. That is, I'll leave aside the policy, because I see we're running late and I'm sure you got other things to talk about. I'll leave aside the policy instruments, but that's what cities should want. And whether they have a policy instrument to do that, or whether Miriam thinks that the market will provide that, I'm quite, hey, I'm a classical liberal. I love the markets in all things where we can use them. I'm not sure we get the market to do this here, but I know that's the outcome that we want, is to reduce. You don't get rid of parking. There's still going to need to be parking. There's going to be places to store vehicles. It doesn't need to be everywhere. You can find ways to move it into tighter, denser, smaller areas. That's what cities should ultimately want out of driving automation. That's my answer to the question.
And jumping off of that,
sorry, go ahead, Miriam.
Just briefly jumping off of that, also, that's another way to discourage private AV ownership. If you were to say, okay, we're going to make it really expensive to park in downtown because we just don't need as much parking and there's going to be way less of it, then that'll encourage more trips through shared AVs rather than private ones.
So, but I think cities don't want what Andrew just suggested. I think some cities do, but I think cities want to keep their residents. I mean, we're sort of anthropomorphizing cities, right? But and I think that has actually been the history since the 50s and through the 60s, 70s, is to make the cities as much like the suburbs as possible in terms of the convenient use of an automobile, even at the expense of what makes a city a city. And I think that's been changing, and that's what we're up against.
Great. This has been a great discussion so far. I want to talk a little bit about advocacy, including kind of the impacts of the curb, narrative here that I've brought up in the past. I gave a talk 10 years ago, I think, or almost 8 years ago at a transportation conference about how we should really before the AVs get here, we should be leveraging the narrative around them to advocate for more land use changes. And I think, Rachel, in our pre-discussions, we've had some discussions around using this narrative to to make parking reform and density more palatable, right? I would say when I got rid of my car in 2008 in Portland, people thought that's a little crazy. Once we had Lyft and Uber, it was a little more like, I can imagine my life in that way. And then if you can convince someone that autonomous vehicles aren't hype and aren't a disaster, they can also then imagine, okay, I could imagine not having a car. And to me, a lot of the wins we need to get are by actually just reducing individual car ownership overall. That's what leads to higher transit ridership and more space for us to build this good stuff. And Rich, you talked about this bridging the valley of death from car dependence. Do you want to share like kind of what how we might use this narrative, whether or not it's true, to actually get some more of this accessibility in better places?
Yeah, I mean that I think that valley of death exists in every major policy change. And that's why I think this has to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary. And I think you've already actually laid out the evolving path. But I do think that to be successful, and I think parking reform has actually been a great sort of a leading edge on this, because as we have in some places unbundled parking, we've started to see that it actually does have real impacts on how people decide to make trips. So I think that we need to continue to increment on shared streets, on protected bike lanes, which I would take protected bike lanes over a city full of autonomous vehicles any day of the week. So I think that as we continue to whittle away and use autonomous vehicles, absolutely, for transit. I mean, the first driverless trains were running in the 1920s. I mean, they were only carrying post materials, right? It was a freight application. But even still, increasingly, we have been autonomous trains have been a thing for a long time. Shuttles are a great application. As we continue to double down on collective transport, in addition to shared transport, I think we do start to reduce people's need to use their cars. And we've really got to tip in that direction. As you said, as these things happen, people can start, it's social learning, and you see somebody who's carless. You're like, oh, that's ridiculous. But then like, oh, maybe I could do that, right? There's actually big literature in social learning. So I think that we just need to kind of double down on some of these things rather than embrace the next silver bullet, right? I think that we've got also a history of thinking each next new thing is going to solve all of our problems. But I think it's kind of very back to the future basic. It's a
Great.
tool.
Okay, we're close to end, and I want to really end, as I said up top, with some actionable advice. And so I'm going to go Miriam, Andrew, and back to Rachel on one piece of advice that PRN members can use to move their community towards whatever you think is the better scenario here. What if you were going to, advocate for something or take an action or, write a blog post proposing something? What, go testify at City Hall. What would be the thing that you think someone should do right now to point us towards paradise, as opposed? Yeah.
That's a big ask. I would say briefly, like first, just encourage particularly skeptics just to try, if they have the opportunity, a robo-taxi. And especially older adults with mobility issues. I think there's a huge promise with these things for, especially in not super dense urban areas, but in also in like suburban and rural areas, as a way for people who not to be stuck at home. And it could be a huge boon, I think, and even just for healthcare access and all those kinds of, there are huge costs with paratransit and insufficient, basically transportation in a lot of the country, if you can't drive. So I think in that sense, just encourage your neighbor skeptic. And also in terms of policy, push for, once we get rid of a street spot, let's quickly fill it in with some other use. Don't just let it be another lane. Let it be something that let it be a outdoor restaurant or what have you. And let's take this moment of opportunity to just kind of change our local streets.
Andrew?
I'd agree everything what Miriam just said. So rather than repeat what she said, I'll go back to what we said before. Road pricing is what we need more than anything else. Gas taxes aren't going to fund the roads. It's the only tool that can fight congestion. It's the technocratic dream. The advent of self-driving cars actually provides a thin end of a wedge because you can start by just taxing this. You can say only the self-driving cars are subject to this, at least at first, because the nature of the technology, the telemetry is such that you always know where they are and how fast they're moving and what time they entered what zone. You can dynamically price them the way you cannot easily dynamically price a human-driven vehicle. So it'll not only blunt the congestion impact that self-driving can provide in crowded urban areas, but it also is, once you've gone that far, very soon then it becomes a fairness argument. Well, all cars should be subject to this, and let's proceed to make that happen, which would eliminate the externalities of driving is like the single technocratic thing we can do to make cities and the overall transport network better. AVs give us an opportunity to do that. Let's not let that opportunity go to waste.
Rachel?
I think we need to just keep changing the conversation about car use.
Very
And
brief.
everything that Andrew and Miriam just said.
Great. I want to acknowledge that there have been a lot of good questions in the chat. I appreciate the people who've been responding to one another on this. We can't cover everything on this topic in an hour. We tried to cover, aspects of it that I think have not been always out there in the conversation. So I appreciate you all, and I hope we continue having this discussion. Thank you to our panelists here. I'm going to pass it back to Paula to close us out on time. We'll post this on YouTube soon so people can review, and thank you all.